What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. In this awesome Switch 2 video, we're going to be going deep into the Switch 2 CPU and the performance versus PlayStation 5 and PlayStation 4, because many people have been wondering just how bad or how good this CPU is really going to be for Switch 2. Is it going to cause problems for developers? And we're also going to talk about DLSS for Switch 2, including whether or not actually doing native resolutions like 1440p and 4K are actually going to be something worth doing on the console when you see the relation to DLSS and the actual benefits visually it brings. We're going to go deep into this information, so if you do enjoy this content, please hit the like button and subscribe for more, and we will get started. So the big example we all like to use lately, of course, with CD Projekt Red is Cyberpunk 2077. It's well known to be using DLSS, but also it's a very heavy CPU usage game, and many people wondering, well, is it going to have issues on the Switch 2 running because of the high demands of the CPU? And as we've seen in various comparisons, so far so good. Basically, it looks like it runs really well on Switch 2. They're targeting 30 frames per second right now in docked mode. I don't know if they will be able to actually progress beyond that. We know the Xbox Series S version of this game did have a patch later on, like 2 years later, that gave it a 60 frames per second mode, but they had to lower the resolution quite a bit to get there to below 800p to around 640p to 800p range to get 60 frames per second on that console. So Switch 2 CPU has been a big topic between the communities. Basically, is it going to be something that's going to really hold down the performance of the console? Is it going to actually prevent games from being ported to Switch 2? Including games like Grand Theft Auto 6, people have really been concerned about that game in particular being ported to Switch 2. So we're going to do a deep dive here of the Switch 2 CPU, and we're going to find out kind of the estimated range of what to expect of this CPU. And we're going to start by looking at the information that was provided by the channel that actually broke the information for the SoC. And they are known as GeekerOne, and they did a deep dive of the actual scan of the SoC. They found out that it was the A78C ARM 8-core processor, and it's docked at 1 gigahertz, and then handheld mode would be 1.1 gigahertz. And you know, as far as the explanation as to why Nintendo did that, we can go on and on about that forever, but basically it has something to do with the battery life, most people have said, with the GPU having to balance it and whatnot. But they did talk about running the CPU test and performance. So as you can see here, they did a test in relation to the Switch 2 CPU. Now we're only going to focus on the docked mode for Switch 2. We're not going to talk about handheld mode here. That's for another topic of discussion. But since personally I'm going to be playing this mainly docked, we're going to focus on docked performance for Switch 2. So they did a performance graph of Geekbench 6, which is a CPU performance test that they ran on multiple different CPUs. They did the PS5 CPU, which is based on a Zen 2 8-core 16-thread 3.5 GHz CPU. And they did a test of the Jetson Orin NX, which uses the A78C in its processor. So they did a test here, and they have the scores. And obviously, as you can see, it's lower than the PS5, but it is higher than the PS4 and much, much higher than the Switch 1. The question is, though, how much does this going to affect games? Now, there's a really interesting piece of information here about the Switch 2 CPU and the architecture behind it actually providing better instructions per clock than Zen 2, which is the PS5. Now, this was done a few years ago, actually, back on AnandTech, and they are a very, very respected PC, tech-based site. They did a breakdown of the performance levels of the A78 ARM processor back in 2020. And some people actually were speculating back then that Nintendo would use this processor for the Switch 2 way back when this was first revealed, because it made sense because the performance was so good, especially the instructions per clock. And they brought out in these tests here they ran for the CPUs, this particular CPU, the A78, had a slightly higher IPC, PPC than Zen 2, about 8% in Geekbench 5 and 15% in Spec INT 2006. Now, Geekbench 5 was the one before, of course, before they ran Geekbench 6, which is one of the newer ones. But here they're showing an IPC advantage for the A78 processor versus Zen 2. And the interesting thing about this is that we can actually confirm this, so to speak, with this test run here on Geekbench 6. So here we show the Switch 2 docked and the CPU performance in multi-core performance got a 2735 score, and then the PS5 got a 7476 score. But if you look at the left side, we have a single core performance thread here, and the PS5 got 1186, Switch 2 docked got 493. Okay, then you have PS4, which had a 990 multi-core performance and a 197 single core performance. Remember, this is just for this test. Various applications have different demands, but this is the best we can do for now to get an estimation of what to expect for Switch 2 CPU performance, okay? Keep that in mind. So we go back to here. They talked about when this first came out, it looked like this CPU did in fact have instructions per clock advantages over Zen 2 at the same clock speeds. The big advantage for Zen 2, which is what powers the PlayStation 5, is that it can upclock much higher because it's designed for desktop applications, desktop PCs, and of course consoles, whereas the ARM-based CPUs like the A78C, A78 are designed for mobile devices and laptops and tablets. So it's a big difference there in architecture, and also design-wise, the ARM processor is actually designed from the ground up to be run at lower clock speeds because of that, because they're being designed for these lower powered devices. So I did a little diagram here of the performance levels based on the Geekbench 6 CPU performance test. And we have the Switch 2 CPU, of course the ARM A76C, 8-core, 8 threads. It doesn't have 16 threads because it doesn't have multi-threading, but 8-core, 8 threads, 1 GHz docked. PS5, 8-core, 16 threads, 3.5 GHz. Now, according to the test that they ran here, and which is going to be Switch 2 versus PS5 and PS4, PS5 has a 2.73 times faster CPU than the Switch 2. But the Switch 2 has a 2.76 times faster CPU than the PlayStation 4. And then you go to the single core performance. PS5 has a 2.4x times faster CPU in single core performance than Switch 2. And then Switch 2 has a 2.5 times faster CPU in single core performance versus a PlayStation 4. And interesting thing is, though, is that when you look at the performance versus clock speed range, PS5 CPU is clocked at 3.5 times higher the rate than Switch 2. 1 GHz times 3.5 is 3.5 GHz. But the actual performance is only 2.73 times higher in multi-core and 2.4 times higher in single core for the PlayStation 5. So if you do the math, it's all division and percentages. You can do this yourself at home. If you do the math, it equals out to be about a 75% multi-core and 68% single core of the expected advantage from clock rates for the PS5 that are actually reflected in performance tests in relation to the Switch 2. So based on these estimates, the Switch 2 CPU appears to have better IPC instructions per clock than the PlayStation 5 CPU. And this is really good information to be aware of, because when people look at the actual clock speeds of this console versus PlayStation 5, it looks to be dramatically, underpowered versus the PlayStation 5 because of this range. But when you take into consideration that the actual instructions per clock are better than the PlayStation 5 on the Switch 2, because these ARM processors were designed from the ground up basically to run at lower power rates and run well, it makes sense that actually at the lower rates, the ARM processors would have better instructions per clock than the Zen processors were. But overall, though, it's still a much better CPU for PlayStation 5, everyone will agree. And due to it being able to reach these higher clock speeds, for PlayStation 5, obviously the performance is going to be quite a bit better. And as we see, it is better, but it's not like 3.5 times better. it's about 2.7 times better in multi-core and about 2.4 times better in single-core performance. Now, when we get back to what they're talking about here, having the better instructions per clock, yes, these are just estimates at the time back in 2020, but you also have to think when you consider Switch 2 in the developer environment, there have been various different developers that have come on certain forums like Family Boards, for example. There's an individual named Matt, whom I personally trust because he is a verified developer. He is aware of the certain going-ons behind the scenes with the Switch 2 dev kits, and I basically trust what he says. And back in January, he did bring out a post on Family Boards saying that the developers were not really complaining or having an issue with Switch 2's CPU. They're basically having to do some modifications because it's an ARM-based CPU and they have to kind of optimize it a little bit differently. But they didn't say they were having any problems porting games, that were not made from the ground up for Switch 2, basically from other consoles. And he's kind of said that pretty much most of the games will be running on Switch 2 just fine and not having too much issues being ported because of that. And when you look at the actual performance versus PlayStation 4, the PlayStation 4 was already more powerful and much more performant than the Switch 1 was in terms of just its CPU, especially in multi-core performance. You could see here, the PlayStation 4 was far better than Switch 1, and then you have the Switch 2, which is kind of crushing the PS4, to be honest with you. I mean, you could argue that, 2.7 times more performance, but I think that's a lot better, personally, than the PS4. You're getting quite a bit of enhancement even from PS4, and you got to remember that even the PlayStation 4 Pro was still stuck on the Jaguar CPU from PlayStation 4. Even though it was running games with a better GPU, it was hampered and bottlenecked by that. So even though people like to compare the Switch 2 for some reason to a PS4 or PS4 Pro even, it's simply not the case, because even the CPU is quite a bit better than the PS4 or PS4 Pro. And the GPU, as we know, is completely different architecture. It's Nvidia based. It has ray tracing cores, which the PS4 and PS4 Pro did not have. And it has DLSS, which obviously PS4, PS4 Pro, PS5, PS5 Pro do not have. And we know that DLSS is the best upscaling method on the market. So in terms of performance for Switch 2 games, I was a little bit concerned in the past about this because of not knowing really. And doing more of a deep dive here, it kind of alleviates my worry a little bit. But yes, of course, Switch 2 games are not going to be performing quite as well as a PlayStation 5 game would. And, we know that already, right? So, just seeing the games in action, though, kind of tells you that you're getting something that's pretty much similar to an Xbox Series S. I know people like to keep saying it. No, it compares more to a PS4, but I just don't personally see it. Based on the evidence that we're going over here, we can see the visuals for ourselves. The actual visual improvements are more along the lines of an Xbox Series S and even beyond in some areas like picture quality, for example. And, the clarity of textures that DLSS brings is quite a bit better than what Xbox Series S has been able to provide so far. Granted, the actual internal resolution may be running lower than an Xbox Series S, but your eyes pretty much will not see much of a difference there, as we saw in our last comparison video. PlayStation 5 Cyberpunk 2077, even with the ray tracing mode turned on versus Switch 2, we did a direct comparison. The texture quality and clarity of the textures looks very similar on Switch 2 to the PS5 version of the game. That's just factual from the evidence we saw on screen. It's not just me trying to, uphype, or upsell the Switch 2 to you. I think you guys know better than that by now. We go by visual examples here, so I'm doing my best to be fair. Yes, the Switch 2 is not as powerful as the PS5. Has some limitations even versus the Xbox Series S. We knew that already, especially in the CPU area. CPU area of the Xbox Series S is where it excels. It's actually a higher clock CPU than the PlayStation 5 is on Xbox Series S. It just has some issues with RAM, as we know. So there's pluses and minuses to every console, but the Switch 2 has some amazing advantages with DLSS, and we're going to talk about that as well here. Again, with DLSS, DLSS is so good, guys. Like, I kid you not. I downloaded the Stellar Blade demo over the weekend and played it, and I noticed something very interesting about the DLSS, and this was before I even got asked this question on Twitter about the differences between native resolution and DLSS quality mode, for example. So someone, was talking about, what's the big deal of if someone uses DLSS quality mode or not even DLSS at all versus getting 4K? Because Shin'en announced that there's going to be a 4K 60 frames per second quality mode for the Switch 2 version of Fast Fusion, which I think is great. But I did go ahead and ask them, which they have not replied, did you guys confirm using DLSS for this game on Switch 2? There doesn't seem to be any current NDA on this as far as I can tell, since many other devs are able to discuss it for their ports. Now, they haven't responded, of course. So if it's native resolution, that's great, of course. But like, if it's DLSS, though, does that really matter? And I say yes, it does. And somebody asked, why does it matter if it's DLSS or not? But here's the thing. You can run this test at your home as well if you have the demo or an Nvidia based GPU that's a 2000 series and above. But basically, I did a comparison on my own here just because I was curious what the big difference was, if any, that I could notice visually from 4K DLAA, which is deep learning anti-aliasing for Nvidia's version of it for native 4K, in comparison to 4K DLSS quality mode for the same exact graphics preset for this game. So left side is DLAA 4K native, right side is DLSS quality mode. Now, as you know, 1440p is the base resolution input for DLSS quality mode, and they upscale it to 4K. DLSS is so good, though, that many times it may appear that DLSS quality mode, which is 1440p input resolution, looks better than native 4K. And why is that? Well, let's take a look at the pictures here. This is DLAA 4K native. Then we go to the next screen. Same exact area, same exact, pretty much, everything there. All I did is switch settings here to DLSS quality mode. And hopefully you can tell here, but you can see there's more detail on the textures on the wall here on the building and the grading and the mesh here as well. Go back. DLAA is more blurry, and that's just how it is. And if you can't see very clearly, we'll go even closer. Here's DLAA. Now we go to the next screen. Look close at this area right here. And now here's DLSS quality mode. Now you can see the very noticeable difference. It's sharper as well. So you have a sharper image and you have more texture quality detail on the objects with DLSS quality mode. Now, if you zoom way in like we're doing here, you may be able to see more pixels actually in the DLSS quality mode because it is rendering from a lower resolution. But at a glance, and you may not even be able to tell here, but just at a glance, they're both 4K images. But at a glance, you will notice probably that the DLSS quality mode actually looks sharper. It has more detail, especially in the background of objects, because that's what the AI tensor cores are doing. They actually are looking beyond what the 4K image is providing and filling in even more detail. That's what makes DLSS so amazing, and which is why when you see games on Switch 2 actually have more detail, like in the backgrounds or on the grounds of the textures, for example, like we talked about with Cyberpunk 2077, that is the beauty of DLSS. It really actually fills in the blank, so to speak, of more blurry details or just refining details that the AI actually, through deep learning, like neural networks, actually goes through a process of seeing what actually may be placed there for the detail that's missing in an image like this. And I think that is the most amazing thing about DLSS. That's the beauty of the technology that it brings to Switch 2, and that's why games can run at a lower resolution on Switch 2 and quote-unquote get away with it, because of what they're doing with the image processing with DLSS, and they're making things look a lot cleaner. You know, we have all kinds of footage here showing direct feed footage. This is 4K direct feed footage of the Switch 2 version of Cyberpunk 2077. You can see here I have the full output here. It's being output at 4K. It's not rendering, of course, the game at 4K, but it looks great. It looks like Cyberpunk 2077. It runs well, looks clean enough. You can tell it's not native 4K, of course, but does it look distractingly lower resolution? Absolutely not. In fact, it looks really clean considering the internal resolution is probably 720p here. And you really wouldn't be able to tell when playing this. It doesn't look like 720p to me. It looks like it's somewhere between 1080p and like 1200p-ish range, and then being upscaled to 4K, that type of thing. That's kind of how it looks to me personally, to my eyes. I'm looking at this with a 4K monitor. So this is really impressive stuff. This is the biggest advantage I think that Switch 2 has over Xbox Series S. Image quality. Looks next gen. This game in particular, what an amazing game, guys, to have on launch day. Please be with me here on this channel on Thursday, June 5th, as we play this very game, Cyberpunk 2077, for the first time. I am very excited. I will give you the exact times and details of when you can join me live on launch day, and we're going to have an absolute blast. So guys, thank you so much for watching, and hope you enjoyed all the content leading up to launch of Switch 2. I got a big smile on my face because I'm excited to play this on Thursday, June 5th with you guys right here in this channel. Hit the like button for me on your way out, and I'll see you very soon in the next video. Take care.